Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. One of writing's greatest beauties has always come with the fact that it's an ageless profession. An overnight best-selling author, Alka Joshi, reminded us all that that reality is alive and well when her debut novel, The Henna Artist, became a New York Times bestseller upon release in 2020 and a Reese Witherspoon Hello Sunshine book club pick, with the club's founder raving that this novel captivated me from first chapter to the final page, while the Christian Science Monitor loved the vibrant characters, evocative imagery, and sumptuous prose that create an unforgettable tale. Based on the first in the Jaipur trilogy's global popularity, its follow-up, The Secret Keeper of Jaipur, became an instant smash, making Good Morning America's 27 best books for June, while becoming a Los Angeles Times bestseller, a USA Today bestseller, a Globe and Mail bestseller, an indie bookstores bestseller, an Amazon Summer 2020 Readers Pick, Cosmopolitan Best Audiobooks of 2020 pick, and making Book Riot's list for Best Books of 2020, with the Library Journal concluding that the verdict is in. With lush details, a return to favorite characters, and emotional complexity, this story satisfies on every level. Wrapping the trilogy up with her latest release, the third and final book, The Perfumist of Paris, was one that shelf awareness promised fans, takes readers on a multi-sensory journey from a pristine Parisian perfume lab to the bustling markets of Agra in India. Beautifully written and thought-provoking, The Perfumist of Paris continues a compelling family saga, immerses readers in the world of perfume, and asks important questions about the desires and possibilities available to women. She's here today to talk about her exciting career launch over the last 3 years and what she's got coming next. Alka, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. Traveling back to childhood, who are your favorite character creators on the page?
I had to change languages, right? So in India, we were in English schools always, where we were having instruction in English all the time. But at home we spoke Hindi, and so I don't really remember what we read when I was growing up. But then we come to the United States, and the kinds of things that people are reading are the Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys. I was 9, 10 years old, so that's what kids were reading. And then pretty soon after that, 2 or 3 years after that, I start reading Jane Austen and Charles Dickens first. And I love those because those were character driven. And I love the idea of getting to know characters over a long sort of story, and really understanding what creates a story. Like I don't think it was consciously I was not consciously observing that, but I could actually see that stories are better when there is a conflict and then a resolution, conflict, resolution, and then you get to the end, and it's so satisfying to know that your main character has somehow overcome all of those conflicts in some way.
You go on to earn a BA from Stanford and then an MFA from the California College of the Arts before launching a very successful career running your own ad agency for 2 decades. How do you feel looking back on your years in that storytelling arena? That experience aided you in your novel writing to come.
I think that when I got into advertising, once again, that was that story pattern. I didn't realize that's what I was doing. When I created a 30-second commercial or a 1-minute commercial, really what I was doing is creating characters out of nowhere and then having them be involved in a situation, some kind of a conflict, and they resolve it by using the client's product or service, right? And so then when I met my husband, I'd already been in advertising for quite a while. And he said, you're writing little stories. And that was the first time, like, it kind of hit me that that's exactly what I was doing. And then I think about a year into our marriage, he said, I think you want to be a fiction writer. And it was something I couldn't see myself, but for some reason he could see it. And so we were taking these long road trips, and he would say, why don't you write something about your growing up in India? Because he found that fascinating. He's not from India, and he doesn't know any of the stories. And so I started writing them, and I would read them aloud to him during the road trips. And he would say, that's really good, honey. Hold on to that. That's a really good scenario. And then pretty soon he was encouraging me to take evening classes in fiction writing. But that was like 16 years later, because then I could finally hear what he was saying. Oh, maybe I do want to be a fiction writer. So when I started taking the evening classes, I really was just focused on my stories of India. But then pretty soon I enrolled in this master's program, and that was a full intensive 2-year program. And that's when I really started the genesis of the henna artist. And it was a combination of my life in India, my mother's sort of alternate life in India, and then also the fictionalized versions of what was happening at that time.
The New York Times would observe that your debut novel, The Henna Artist, grew out of a question that was close to home. How would a mother's life have been different if she hadn't been in an arranged marriage at 18? Please talk about life imitating art. Please talk about art imitating life and the creation of lead protagonist Lakshmi, who so many readers fell in love with at the top of the Japur trilogy.
The only kind of ways in which I developed Lakshmi were an image of my mother. So Lakshmi looks just like my mother. And I tried to imagine, like, what would it have been like at the time that her parents told her, you need to leave college and you need to get married? What if at that time she already was married and she decided to leave the marriage instead of, leaving college? And so with no education, what could she possibly have done in that marriage? Well, I realized that she needed to have some kind of a skill in order to leave her marriage and do something else. So I dreamed up this abusive husband, and that's a prime example in my life, and not in my life, but in my sort of education about these kinds of things. That's a prime example of why a woman should leave a marriage. I mean, that is like, number one.
Now, for viewers and readers who don't know, please introduce us to just what a henna artist is.
She leaves her marriage with this skill that is taught by her mother-in-law, and then she goes on to forge this life. And then I thought, what kind of a life is she going to forge? Well, in India, henna art is ubiquitous. You see it everywhere. You see it at weddings and festivals, and you see it on little girls' hands and grown-up women's hands. And so I thought, well, that is something. If she has artistic skill, she could do that kind of henna. And then I thought, but what would make her an amazing henna artist, the kind that everybody would want to go to? And I thought, okay, she has to do some kind of henna that no one else is doing. And that's where my imagination kicked in. That's where my wanting to be an artist kicked in, because Lakshmi is doing the kind of henna. She is telling stories through her art on women's bodies. And I think that image, when it came to me, was extraordinary. It gave Lakshmi license to do anything she wanted, and to portray these women's lives, the good, bad, and the ugly parts of their lives. And I, that to me was such a find when I started writing. Not only was this woman like my mother in the way that she carries herself, in the way that she addresses issues with difficult patrons, but she also, I think, has the creativity that my mother did.
One of the most captivating elements of this story is how authentically you painted on the page, so to speak. Did you, for instance, go and watch real henna artists at work and then interpret it in your own images with relative meanings to the stories you wrote?
I draw in my head. So I would draw it in my head, and then I could write about it. For example, in the very first part of the henna artist, the very first chapter, Lakshmi is painting a fig leaf or a fig. She's painting a fig, and she's painting a wasp on the feet of Parvati, her most difficult but largest patron. And where I got that idea is that I had been reading an article about how there are 50 different species of figs, let's say, and each one of them requires a very special wasp to fertilize it. As I was reading this article, I started to get this idea that, wow, it's amazing that this wasp is fertilizing this fig and then it dies inside. So when we eat figs, we are eating desiccated wasps. We don't ever realize it. And I thought there was something kind of sexy in that this wasp is so sated that he dies. And I know that Parvati is very interested in having an afternoon tryst with her husband. So what better way to do that than to paint something on her feet? You know, I think feet are part of the whole sexual act. And so what better way to do that than engage in a conversation with her husband about what is on her feet? And, these are just kind of weird things that happen in my head. And so that is how I realized Lakshmi was going to paint the henna on her feet. So you see what I mean? Like it could come from an article I read. It could come from a knowledge of something that that has come to me over the years. And it all just happens in my head. And then I write it down on paper. That happens with every scene that I have in every book. It happens in my head. I redirect it in my head as if I were the art director. No, move that plant here. Have this person sit on the sofa instead of on that chair. So it all happens in my head, and then I write it down on paper.
Now, it seems almost inevitable that her husband would eventually come looking for her. How did you decide to approach that reunion? Were Publishers Weekly importantly spotlighted within this eloquent and moving story that you masterfully balance a yearning for self-discovery with the need for familial love, and how it would impact Lakshmi's path forward? Or some would argue backward from there.
I knew that he was going to re-enter her life, and I knew that that would become an albatross for her. I had to create that kind of tension in the novel. I knew that. I didn't know where he was going to show up or how he was going to show up, but I realized that her younger sister was a perfect foil for that, right? So her younger sister needs the abusive husband to get her to Jaipur. You know, in India, it's very difficult for a young woman to travel by herself. Even today, it's certainly not a village girl. She could easily be taken advantage of. And so the younger sister is canny enough to know that she needs an older man to accompany her. And what better man than the husband of her sister? So it's kind of like they were using each other, right? And the husband thinks, okay, now it's my chance to find Lakshmi and maybe reunite with her, and then we can be a family again. Not exactly in the way that Lakshmi would want a family, but in the way that he gets to dominate his wife all over again.
Dialogue is one of the most fascinating parts of the fiction writing process. What does your imagination look like with work at words here?
The dialogue comes very naturally to me. And I think that might be because I wrote radio spots for 20 years. And in radio, it's nothing but dialogue. You know, it is a copywriter's domain. So when you write radio, you have the characters in your head. And what's beautiful is when you're actually doing the production for radio, you get to hear it the way that you heard it in your head or not heard it in your head. And sometimes the actors acted in a way that you hadn't realized could be better. So you're constantly doing that back and forth for radio. And so when I write dialogue, it comes very easily. All I have to do, and I think this is the hardest part, is figure out what scene it's taking place in. So the scene is very important. And then there's these two characters that I've sort of figured out the sort of MOs for. And then I think, okay, go, start talking to each other. Go, what are you saying? Now I do have to tell you that I do finesse the dialogue probably 10, 15, 20 times. So I get the basic thread of it, and then I will go back and let's say it's a simple phrase like, tell me how. And I might go, tell me. Does that work better? And I might just have them say nothing and just, think, well, what happens if they just, incline their head in a way that says, go ahead and tell me. So I do work on those kinds of things, those real nuanced sort of edits as I keep looking at that dialogue over and over.
How well do you feel like you got to know Lakshmi by the end of the novel to then have an idea of where you wanted her to wind up?
I had a reader say to me recently that my protagonist takes the kind of turns in her life that I have taken personally. And I didn't even realize that's what was happening with Lakshmi. I wanted her to end up in a place that was real for her, that was her authentic self working. And I think that for so long, just as I had, she was working in a profession as a henna artist and definitely to wealthy patrons. She was working as a henna artist just to survive and to raise enough money so that she could one day have a healing garden. What she really wanted to do was just heal people. And she realizes at the end, as I think I have in my life, that that wasn't what sustained me. That wasn't what brought me pleasure. What brought Lakshmi pleasure was to be a healer. And what brings me pleasure is to be able to voice the kinds of things that I really believe in. I believe in the power of women to be able to change their lives and to be able to run their lives the way they want. I believe in many different kinds of women being able to coexist in this world, not just the ones who give birth, but the ones who don't give birth, but maybe give birth to ideas like myself and like Lakshmi. I believe in the power of entire nations to be able to reinvent themselves, and especially when they have been dominated by another power. And I think that's what was happening in India post-independence. And also, I think it's exactly what's happening in Lakshmi's life. She has gone from the domination of her marriage, her husband, and she has found independence in herself. So I wanted her at the end to have found that independence, to have found what she really loved to do and be able to admit to herself that she could do that exclusively. And I think over the years as a reader, I have come to appreciate the endings that are not perfect. I like it when the main character finds something of what they were looking for, but not exactly what they were looking for. I think that life is evolving, it's ever changing. And I know that it is for myself. So it has to be that way for my characters. So there's no definitive end at the end of my books. There's always the possibility of things that are happening, things that are going to change, things that will crop up in life.
Knowing you were at the beginning of this new journey when you first held that book in your hand must have been quite inspiring and exciting at the same time.
That was amazing to get the first box of books from HarperCollins. I just thought, oh my God, and there's my name. Oh my God, it has become a book. And it took me 10 years to get there. So that was, it felt like a real accomplishment.
Was the henna artist your favorite title all along?
I think it was just henna. I think I just had henna. And then at some point I changed it to the enemy of the crocodile. Because, I use proverbs a lot in my books because that is the way that people were raised in India. My father is always spewing proverbs and he is now 93 years old, right? So the proverb in The Henna Artist goes like this: only a fool stays in the water and remains an enemy of the crocodile. And so Lakshmi knew that she never wanted to be an enemy of the crocodile, and yet that is what happens. So that is what I put as the title. And my editors said, no, we're not, no, that's not going to sell any books. We're not doing that. We have to have a title that sells books. Now, this is where, Jake, I let the people who know best do their work, right? They know how to market books. They know how to design the covers. I do not design the covers. They know how to title books. So, and they know what the genre is that they want the book to be sitting in at a bookstore. So these are all things that I let the people who know best in publishing do.
When during the writing of this first book did it become clear to you that this was intended to be a trilogy versus a standalone novel?
The books did not present themselves as a sequel originally. What happened is that during that 10 years, I got to love these characters and know exactly how they're thinking and feeling. And I'm with them every single day as I'm editing this book and looking at it in a fresh light. And so I knew that Malik was going to grow up to be this amazing boy, still loyal and still very much devoted to Lakshmi. But how was he going to show that in life? And so for me, it was really important that we see the grown-up Malik. And he just kept hammering at my head when I finished The Henna Artist that you've got to write my story. So I wrote his story.
Let's dive in greater depth into Malik's sojourn here, where the Library Journal reports picks up the story 12 years later and is told alternately in the voices of henna artist Lakshmi, her protege Malik, and Nimi, Malik's beloved, adding that with lush details, a return to favorite characters. Where did you find his story led you as you began writing the best-selling sequel, The Secret Keeper of Jaipur?
When I was first creating The Henna Artist, it was letting the character lead me. And every day I would discover, oh, Lakshmi wants to go here. Oh, and now this person is going to create a problem in her life. And I would work on those chunks at a time. When I got to the second book and the third book, I had a pretty good idea of where it was going to go. I didn't know the details, but it's sort of the third scenario that you just outlined, where I kind of know the details. I kind of know where they're headed from part 1 to part 2 to part 3, but I don't know exactly how they're getting there. So then once again, I'm letting the character lead me, but I have sort of an end goal for every one of those acts.
How different did it feel for you writing from the male protagonist's point of view versus Lakshmi's in the first novel?
I found it a little challenging to write from a male protagonist point of view. I knew Malik's character, but as a guy, I sort of had to ask my husband, like, okay, how would he react in this situation? What would happen here? And I think I've read enough of male characters, and once again, I'll point to Dickens, or he's always writing from a male point of view, and various other books I've read, Cormac McCarthy, and Larry McMurtry. I think I understand the basic ideas of what motivates men to do certain things. So I think I did a pretty good job with Malik. Maybe there were some areas where, I don't know, a guy would not have been as sensitive as Malik was, but there are sensitive men in this life, and my husband, is one of them. So he's sort of a good role model for me for Malik.
Did you have an idea early on of who Malik was going to wind up with by the end of the novel?
Yes, exactly. I did not know, by the way, whom he was going to marry or whether he was going to marry. So that actually came from the first epilogue that I had written, and in the henna artist that did not make it to the final. I wrote like 10 epilogues, and only one of them, of course, became the final for the henna artist. And in one of those, I had a scene where he wasn't married yet, but he had somebody in mind, like back in Shimla where he was living. So I think that kind of surprised me at the end, whom he marries. And I think in a way, it's sort of what I'm trying to say in every book. People don't have to follow the social circumstances they're in, or the religious circumstances that they grew up in order to find the person to marry. I think that we can cross religious lines, we can cross racial lines, we can cross a lot of divides in whom we choose to marry. And so I think in each book, that is a little bit of what I'm trying to say with each of the alliances.
A beautiful message indeed. What were any other important themes or history you wanted to explore or advocate for or against in this work?
One of the things I really am trying to emphasize in these books, and I do it in a subtle way, I don't do it directly, is that the world seems to have an impression that in India, Muslims and Hindus have never gotten along. And the common rhetoric is that Hindus are always trying to push out the Muslims from India. But the reality is that 1955 and way before the partition happened, Muslims and Hindus all lived together peacefully. There was not this impression that there is now in the world. In fact, even today, when you go to India, you will find many Muslims and Hindus living in the same neighborhoods, celebrating the same festivals. A lot of Muslims celebrate the Hindu festivals, and owning businesses together, and our main actors and actresses, the most popular ones, they're all Muslim in India. And no Hindu ever says, I'm not going to go see that movie because there are Muslims in it. So I think that there's a misperception in this world, and it's politically motivated. I get that. But there's a misperception that India is cruel to certain minorities, and that is not the case. So one of the things I wanted to accomplish by having Malik be Muslim and Lakshmi be Hindu is to create that symbiosis and to remind people of that symbiosis. There is sort of a political thread in all of my books, and I need to leave people with the impression of India the way that I could not express it when I was an immigrant to this country at the beginning. When I was an immigrant, the impression that most people had of India, and that made me very embarrassed and ashamed, was that India was this developed third world country where everybody was poor and there wasn't any food and clean water and so on. And I did not come from that background, so I couldn't understand it. And the reality is that just like every other country in India, there are wealthy people, there are middle-class people, and there are poor people. And the reason that they were so the poor were extremely represented in India in 1947 at the time of independence was because the British had destroyed so many of the industries that Indians depended on for a livelihood. One of those was textile, the other one was steel making, and the other was shipbuilding. Three major industries. Oh, and salt making. Remember, Gandhi's salt marches were all about the fact that Indians were being taxed for making their own salt. Most of India, as you know, is surrounded by ocean, so it's easy for Indians to make salt and distribute it. But the British taxed salt so heavily, especially if it was Indians who were making it, that a lot of Indians had to stop legally making salt. So there were so many industries that the British used to weaken India so that they could do what they wanted in India. They could remove most of her wealth. They could remove most of the riches of the land. So there's a thread of that running through my books, if you read carefully. And I want people to understand that India is a remarkable country in that even 50 years after independence, 70 years after independence now, it has grown economically in amazing ways. And it is still a democracy, whatever people may think of democracy in the United States and how maybe it's a full democracy, maybe it's not 100% democracy. Same thing with India. It's not perfect, but India has risen in a way that other colonized countries have not. And I really want the world to appreciate India for how resilient her people are. And I don't think right now she is recognized as that, but I would hope that after reading my books, people feel that way.
So by the time we arrive at the point circa 1947 Paris, once you began work on the third leg of this saga, how long had you been looking forward to reaching the reunion between Lakshmi and Radha? And where did you want the relationship to head once they did?
I knew that they had to come back, but I also know, because I have two siblings, that you can love them and hate them in the same breath. And I knew that while they are going to come together, there will still be unresolved issues between them. So, and I knew what those were, of course, without being a spoiler. So I wanted to create that very real understanding of each other. I think eventually Radha was going to grow up and realize that she can't just get away with everything she wants, and that she needs somebody like Lakshmi in her life to temper her impulses. Um, I think in a way, Radha has me in her as well. Because I remember when I was a teenager, just really being a brat with my mom, just telling her, oh, you don't understand me. You don't understand young people. You don't understand Americans. And, she tried her best. She was trying her best. She never said to me, hey, you're Indian. You have to act this way. She was really trying to adjust to the Indian child becoming an American. Um, and I remember as I got older, I thought, okay, I understand what mom was doing. And I did, sort of um, come around to her point of view about things.
Within The Perfumist of Paris, self-awareness found intoxicating. The fact that Joshi's narrative bursts with the sense of the perfume ingredients Radha creates. The cacophony of color, sound, and scent in India contrasts sharply with the sterility of Radha's perfume lab, but Joshi, like Radha, moves skillfully between settings. You've displayed a remarkable talent for evoking senses within your vivid and almost tangible descriptions as explored above. How did you bring all those sensory details so fully to life for readers?
I knew when I wrote the henna artist and the future stories of these people that Radha, at the time that the second book is taking place, is actually in Paris living her life. So I thought, okay, I've got to write Radha's story. And I knew when I wrote the henna artist and I wrote those future stories for these people that didn't make it, by the way, into the epilogue, I knew that Radha was going to work in the perfume industry. So she is in Paris in the third book in 1974, working in the perfume industry. The reason I chose 1974 is because by that time, maybe this is a spoiler. Something that happened in the henna artist had to mature for 17 years in order to make it to the perfumist of Paris. And I needed for Radha to be at that moment in Paris when it happens. The research for the perfumist of Paris was really extensive because I don't wear perfume and I don't know a lot about perfume. So that the henna artist is in production at Netflix as a streaming series. So I was talking to my producer and Michael Edelstein, and I said, hey, I need to learn about perfume and so on. I was just threw that out. And he said, hey, I know the perfect person for you to talk to in New York City. So he put me in touch with her. I went out to New York. I met with her. She introduced me to a few master perfumers. She had me go into one of the biggest perfume labs in New York City. And those people then referred me to places in Paris. So I flew to Paris and I met with master perfumers there. And I saw some of the big labs there and the bottling plants and the big formularies. And then from there, I flew to Grasse, which was known as the perfume capital of the world at one time. And I met with small boutique perfumeries there. And then I flew to Lisbon, where there were two master perfumers I had to talk to. One of them was actually in the business of perfume making, as his family had been for centuries. He had retired to Lisbon, but actually he had grown up in and around Paris and Grasse. And he is now 83. So he was the kind of guy in Radha and Pierre's age in 1974 in Paris. And I wanted to know what that was like, especially in the perfume world. So he told me all about the hedonism and so on. That was really fun. And the other woman I met with was a young Indian woman who is making her own line of perfumes. So, it just comes sort of full circle, right? Most of the ingredients for perfume making, as I learned in my research, come from India. They come from the Southeast Asian part of this world and the Indian subcontinent. And I don't think that those areas have been recognized for all of the raw materials and the essential oils that are produced there. That are put in perfumes. And I think it's wonderful that now Indians are claiming that for themselves. There are several perfume houses that are coming from India saying, hey, we want to be a global entity. One of them, by the way, is Leela Nur perfume. And I will be sort of co-branding with them with the Perfumist of Paris in the coming year. I think it's so fascinating. We writers, we will do, let's say I write 100 pages of notes for my research. I use only a fraction of that in the actual book. Radha is in the Perfumist of Paris several times in her lab. And when I do the lab sections, I know what the lab looks like now. I can describe it easily because of where I've been. I can describe the kind of ingredients that she is putting into the perfume that she is formulating. I understand women like her boss, who is modeled after a very famous master perfumer in the 1970s, a Jewish woman who was incredibly well known in the field at a time when it was a male-dominated profession. And so those are things that I can incorporate into the book. I can also incorporate how Radha feels when she is surrounded by scent. A lot of these master perfumers told me that this is a very visceral profession for them. This is something they look forward to doing every single day. They enjoy going to work. They enjoy meeting with new clients who say, I want, my perfume to smell like rainbows or whatever. And so then they get to work, and it's a creative endeavor for them. I don't think I have met happier people in their profession as I did. So that is an experience that I wanted Radha to have in the book. And now we understand why she loves her profession so much that she is not willing to give it up just for a contented home life with Pierre.
So whether the old guard who invented the cautionary adage, never judge a book by its cover, like it or not, readers absolutely, without question, judge and often buy new books because of their covers, because of them. And within the Jaipur trilogy, all three have beautiful covers. I can't say covers 3 fucking times. What kind of input did you have on their respective creations? Once you'd handed the books in, what kind of input did you have on their respective creations? Once you'd handed the books in, what kind of input did you have on their respective creations?
I did get a couple of covers that Lakshmi was wearing clothes that she would never have worn, or Lakshmi was wearing clothes that are maybe more or less city-like or village-like than she is. So I did have to put the kibosh on some of those cover choices that they sent me. And I did get to choose the final because whenever I choose a final, it actually turns out to be what most people have voted on anyway, because they've all read the book within the publishing team that I have, and they have an idea of what it should look like. So it's really interesting to me that they do rely on me for the authenticity of the background and the woman that they're going to show on the cover. I love that. And I just think that the suggestions they come up with are amazing. Sometimes they do have to marry two things, the background to the woman. They do have to Photoshop that together because, it's the woman is perfect in one scenario and the background is perfect in another.
Now, this trilogy has TV adaptation written all over it. Can you give the viewer a sense of how it worked that this wound up at Netflix, which seems like the perfect home for it?
Well, what's interesting is that I think every journey is different to screen adaptation. Mine went like this. As soon as my book was picked for the Reese Witherspoon Book Club, I started getting calls from producers who wanted to adapt the henna artist for the screen. And I didn't know what to do. So I called my literary agent. What do I do now? And she said, oh, we have a screen management agent that you can work with. So I signed up with Ellen Goldsmith Vane, who is the CEO of the Gotham Group. And then she said, okay, Alka, here's how the process works. We will tell the producers whether you want a TV scenario or do you want a movie? And I said, oh, I want a streaming scenario because I love streaming. I love binging. I love doing episode after episode. I rarely ever watch films anymore because 90 minutes is not enough to satisfy me. So she said, okay, so we will tell the producers that's what you want. And then I will set up all the Zoom meetings. So that's what she did. And as we set these up, I got a pretty clear idea that Michael Edelstein, Frida Pinto, and Miramax TV had the team that I think it was the closest to the vision I had of the henna artist. And that was a very lush production, almost like Downton Abbey. And one of the first things Michael said to me is, we see this as an Indian Downton Abbey. And I said, oh my gosh, okay, sold. So I sold my option to them. Then came the negotiation of how involved I would be in the project. I said, hey, what if I write the screenplay? And they said, have you ever written a screenplay? I said, no. And they said, well, you know what? That's kind of a tall order if you've never written one before. And this is a series, so it's going to be a lot of writing. We would suggest that we actually hire our own team of scriptwriters. I said, okay. I went to Ellen and I said, what should I do? She said, well, they're going to pay you more money to run. Just sell the option to them, and then let's see what happens. But I'm going to make you an executive producer. I will fight for that. So then you get to look at all the scripts, you get to make comments, you get to say, this isn't right, this is not the way Lakshmi would talk, or this is not a scene that would ever really happen. But you got to understand, Alka, that when you write for TV or the screen, you are going to have changes. Your book is a lot of interior dialogue with Lakshmi and herself. So that can't happen in a film, or we'd be bored to death. So that has to take place in scenes, and it has to take place between characters, maybe add new characters to make things happen. And she said, you just have to understand that that's what's going to go into play. So I said, okay. So I said, I will take the money, and you guys, do what you want. And they have been sharing scripts with me. They're actually really, really wonderful team. I am so excited about this team, Jake, because first of all, they're very inclusive. And they are checking things with me all the time. They had me do character studies of all the different characters so they could understand when their team starts writing the scripts. And I think it's going to be a great production. I think it's going to be so lush. And it's sort of what I envision for Lakshmi and Radha and Malik.
Have you got as far as casting?
No. I think that the casting will take place very shortly after Netflix then approves the scripts. So here's kind of what happens, and I didn't realize this. My producers then pitched the henna artist to all these different streaming companies, and they ended up getting 5 offers. So 5 different streaming companies were interested. Netflix came in and had the biggest offer. So that's the one that they've gone with. And I think Netflix, not only did they have a good offer, but they also have the largest distribution. So so that was kind of a no-brainer. So my production team is fabulous.
You started book tour during COVID virtually. How much fun has it been in more recent times to be able to meet your ever-expanding fan base of readers in person, face-to-face?
I am doing a 20-city book tour. And so, it's a East Coast, West Coast, East Coast, West Coast. It's back and forth. So I'm excited about that. I'm also looking at my wardrobe and figuring out what I can wear that'll be different for every 5, bookstores that I go to. So that is happening.
What's coming up next? Is there a new trilogy or maybe a standalone in the works that we can look forward to?
I am off to Europe for the month of May, but I have a couple of pet projects that I haven't gotten started on, and I would love to. One of them is a graphic novel about my time in India when I was growing up. And another is a set of New Yorker cartoons. I've always loved New Yorker cartoons. I have gone to presentations by Roz Chast and R.O. Blackman. I love those New Yorker cartoons. So I've had dogs, most of my life, and I would like to do a series of cartoons about my dogs.
Your out-of-the-gate success is just a fantastic inspiration and amplification of a message to new authors that, as we said at the top of the show, writing is a truly ageless profession that you can begin anytime you believe in yourself enough to try. What words of encouragement would you give to those who are hoping to see the same dream come true?
I think that one of the main things you have to have is patience. You have to have patience because your first 2 drafts are not enough. You need to do draft 3 and draft 4 and draft 5. And you have to keep looking at things like dialogue that we discussed before. Does this really feel real? Talk it out loud. Talk out everything in your scenes out loud and see how that sounds. And you will find the false. You will find, what doesn't ring true. I think another thing is to write what you're passionate about. A lot of people ask me, did I write the henna artist because I love henna, or did I want to just write about some woman in 1955? And I'm like, no, this has to be the life I imagined for my mother, who didn't get to live such an independent life as Lakshmi had a chance to. And then I was imagining, how would my mother have led an independent life at that time? So I think that because it was a passion project for me, that comes across in the novel. And then the third thing is that you have to persist. It doesn't matter if you get a no the first time or the second time or the third time. It may happen, eventually. The henna artist was actually rejected the first couple of times it went to a publisher. And one of the reasons the agent told me is because it was hard for publishers to understand where a novel about India would fit in to their understanding of novels about India. They had three major areas of understanding. One was partition, books about partition. Another one was books about poverty, what they call poverty porn. So like Rohinton Mystery is a poverty porn story, right? Salman Rushdie's stories are partition stories. And then a third category is immigration. What does it feel like for somebody who is from India jumping over into the United States, and like Jhumpa Lahiri did that in The Namesake. So those were the three categories they were familiar with. They couldn't understand how a novel like The Henna Artist from the 1950s about just regular people leading their lives, where would that fit? How would they be able to sell it within their team? And luckily, my agent knew very well the acquiring agent at Mira Books and had known her for 30 years. And she knew that she had gone to India and loved India and understood India. So when Kathy Sagan got the book, she said, oh my God, I'm buying this. I'm buying this, and everybody in my publishing board is going to love it. So that's kind of how that happened. And so I think you have to be ready for a couple of no's before you get to a yes. And as I've gotten to know more and more authors, published authors, what I found is that some of them actually wrote a novel or two that didn't go anywhere, but then their third novel that they wrote, the agent was ready and willing to sell. So maybe you just have to, have a couple in the bag before you can sell something.
Alka, congratulations on all your new success. It's been wonderful speaking today, and thank you so much for taking our time to be on About the Authors TV.
I love the way, Jake, that you have come around with all three books. You started with one and then the second and then the third, but you've done it so seamlessly. I love that.